Mr. Chairman, friends, I confess that the introductory remarks of your chairman have reduced me to a state of nervousness, an experience which doesn't naturally come ordinarily home to me. I am grateful to him for the very warm and generous tributes he has paid, and I was incidentally reminded of a parallel episode that took place in the lifetime of Mr. Bernard Shaw, when one of the enthusiastic admirers of Bernard Shaw took the chair and proceeded to introduced him in grandiloquent terms, recounted all the details of his biographical adventure, took considerable portion of the time allotted to the speaker to speak. At the end of it, when Bernard Shaw was called upon to say a few words, he got up and said, "After this, the only address I can deliver is that I live on 96 Queen's Road, London." Probably the only distinction is that my friend has been more earnest and he has very feelingly presented me to you. But that incidentally complicates the very onerous undertaking I must discharge to be able to merit the very generous, warm, cordial sentiments that have been expressed by him. I think he has seen more of the inner goodness of his own heart in me, rather than he has given a very objective account of the stuff out of which I am made. I was told that you are celebrating International Understanding Week. And international understanding is basically connected with the problem of war and peace. Very few of us are really aware, I mean meaningfully aware, firstly of the kind of world in which we live. In some sense, this is the world at which Adam and Eve lived, moved, and had their being. But in some strange sense of that expression, it is no longer the same world in which you and I live, move, and have our being. The world has been transformed. Physical aspect of the world in the astronomical sense might be the same as it was many thousands of years ago, but the situation of the man in the world has undergone radical changes. In some sense, it is not the same world in which our ancestors lived. Actually, the rate of change which registers itself is so great. Events are moving with such tremendous temporal velocity that it is more or less true to say that we are living through an age of revolution, because the rate of change is such that it is nothing short of revolution in which we are living. Now, what is the essential feature of the world in which we live, which distinguishes it as the world of the mid-20th century man? If you could concentrate on that distinguishing feature which characterizes the world in which the modern man is made to live, then perhaps you will have an approach to the problem of international understanding and derivatively of the problem of modern war and of peace. Firstly, I think it is true to say what has taken place is that the human brain has acquired tentacles and powers in the sense of extension, which have given him a link with the whole family of mankind. Up to now, his muscle power has had extensions. Modern machines are able to do that which millions of arms can do. In some sense, the burden of the human muscle has been transferred to the machine. But that is a 19th century idea. It's not a contemporary idea at all. But the contemporary idea is that the very extension of the human brain has taken place. And this is illustrated by the fact that today, by the modern scientific and technological devices, we are able to see, standing anywhere, what is happening anywhere else in the world. We are able to hear what takes place anywhere in the world, and in turn we are able to project our voices all over the world. Our power of perception and our power of communication is no longer a localized affair. In terms of modern science, the expression that is being used by sociologists is that the ecological sweep of the modern man has become tremendously important and enormous. Consider the case of the lives of our ancestors, let us say 100 years ago. They lived in some isolated spot. Their movements, by the kind of methods of transportation and communication they had, were restricted to a very narrow perimeter. They could travel, let us say, within the range of 50 miles or 100 miles. Beyond that, it was not even desirable or necessary to move out. Of course, they did not know what was happening in different parts of the world. In turn, their experiences were local experiences, personal experiences. They may have recorded them, left them where they were, but they were not being shared by the whole of the humanity. Today, the days of isolated expressions are gone. Days of isolated cultures are gone. The days of isolated civilizations are gone. We are truly living in one world civilization, and we are truly sharing experiences no matter where they occur, in whatever distant part of the world they occur. They are capable of being shared, and we are daily sharing them, whether we share them through the modern newspaper, through the modern radio communication, television devices, implemented by a superior strategy of the tail-star reaction, or the picture magazine, or by jet travel. But in 1001 ways, modern technology has elongated your power of perception. It has engirdled the whole of the planet. Does this not really mean that today your capacity of thought and your capacity of feeling and your capacity of perception enables you to perceive that which your fellow man is perceiving, let us say on the south of the Sahara, or in Latin America, or he is in Japan, or no matter where he is? With his eyes you can see, with his ears you can hear, with his heart you can feel. This remarkable phenomena of the mid-20th century, facilitated by the advancement of technological and scientific revolution of our own time, virtually has meant this, that whole family of mankind as if is today tenanting a very small, over-congested global village. The world has shrunk. It appears to be a little village. And therefore, everything that is happening in that village begins to be the concern and is the point of feeling and thinking and willing of all of us. Humanity has been brought closer together as it has never been brought before. It is not a mechanical togetherness which merely is connoted by the words like annihilation of space and time, but it is a feeling of oneness, a sharing. I'm not merely thinking of economic interdependence so that the prices fall and rise according as crops somewhere are growing or not growing. A crop failure in Brazil of oranges might affect the value of Sylhet oranges. This is an economic fact, but that fact has been witnessed for the last at least 50 to 60 years. I'm not thinking of that type of shrinkage of the world. I'm thinking it more in psychic terms, more in mental terms, more, as I said, the extension of the brain of the human being. So the brain of the individual today has become the brain of whole mankind. And whole mankind is more or less operating as the cells are operating in my organism. We individuals are beginning to feel that we are the cells in a total organism of one humanity, because we feel and we suffer and we share the joys and the sorrows which are suffered and shared by other persons. This is a remarkable phenomenon in history indeed. Parallel with it comes the second facet of modern man's involvement in this, what I call a new world which is emerging, a world in which our ancestors never lived. Our ancestors saw the same sunrise and the same sunset, probably the same stars over their head. Probably they walked over the graves of their ancestors much in the manner as we do. But the psychic world, the world of social cosmos, is radically different. It is a different world in which we are living, in which we are finding our existence. What is the second feature? The second feature is that the concept of the quantitative power has disappeared. The control that man has acquired over the forces of nature and the consequential increase in the quantum of power which he controls today has made modern perceptive thinkers say that we are living in an age in which the quantitative concept of power has disappeared. That is, it is no longer possible to quantify power. The mathematical notion of power as being a quantity has disappeared. I want you to grasp that idea, because this is radically a new idea which is coming up on the surface of modern history. And it is the perception of this idea with which is linked up the kind of world in which we live, which is being described as an atomic age or as the nuclear age. When in the classical times, in the not far away, even in the time of Bismarck, war strategy had to be manipulated, then you could find out the striking power of your opposing army in terms of the deviance that he had, the industrial potential that he had, the economic potential that he had, the manpower he had, the superior weapons with which destruction was organized and manipulated, question of logistics. These were all the elements that entered in the concept of the power of a certain army. Now this was all capable of being expressed mathematically. So many divisions, so much manpower, so much economic production, so much of industrial production. This was all capable of being expressed mathematically. In the nuclear age in which you and I live today, the concept of quantitative power has ceased to be relevant for the simple reason that the destruction potential of thermonuclear weapons is so great that it is immaterial if you have 2 hydrogen bombs and your opponent has 400 hydrogen bombs. It makes no difference. He may have 400 times as much as you have. But if the destruction potential of hydrogen bomb is what you know it is, then it is immaterial if somebody has 10 times as much. makes no difference, because you may as much destroy him. He may of course destroy you 10 times, but destroying you 10 times is no more than destroying you once. You can only hang a man once, you can't hang him 10 times. Therefore the concept of the quantitative power had disappeared. Not far away, in my own childhood, we used to have a little illustration of this, which I think conveys the idea far more effectively. It is said that a peasant in Sindh started selling scorpions. Scorpions, you know, are dangerous. And one wonders why anybody should be selling scorpions. But probably you are aware that people sell even snakes for the purpose of probably collecting their poison. And the wonderful thing about this transaction of sale by this peasant was that he had placed the same price on the small scorpion as also on a very big scorpion. They were all lying on the table, and the price was same, let us say 12 annas for all of them. And so another person confronted him and he said, you have no common sense. You should not charge same price. For the bigger one you should charge more, and for the smaller one you should charge less. He said, yes, you touch any one of them and then we can settle the price. Now it is this concept which has been revived in a new dimension by the emergence of the thermonuclear weapons of destruction. Actually, the bomb that was exploded in 1945 over Hiroshima and Nagasaki bears no resemblance at all with the lethality and enormous destructive potential which modern weapons have acquired. And then the system of delivery which has been perfected. Nuclear warheads now can be carried from one continent to another in matters of minutes. The war strategists in the United States say that if there is a release of an intercontinental ballistic missile carrying a nuclear warhead from a base in the Soviet Union, then we will only have a notice in advance through radar arrangements of 4 minutes and about 30 seconds. That's all. No further notice than that is possible. And that computers might misread the indications and may make it appear that a nuclear warhead has been released from a hostile base, when in fact it has not been so released, is a possibility which is staring us full in the face. And as a result of that miscalculation, United States, beginning to believe that Soviet Union has taken the initiative, may in retaliation try to strike, and that might be then the end of whole civilization. Actually all the labor of mankind, all our sciences and our arts and our music and our basic cultures and our literature, things of which we are justly proud, can thus be reduced to a smithereen, and whole humanity may be buried in a debris of ruins, atomic ruins. It is estimated that such of us as will survive will not be able to come out for 90 days from their dug-ins, because the nuclear fallout is supposed to be available for contamination for 90 long days. And if you come out of it, then you probably begin to rebuild the foundations of civilization. These are possibilities that are staring us full in the face. These are not fairy stories. They are recounted by hard-boiled strategists, people who specialize in war technology and are advisors of superpowers, nuclear powers like United States and Soviet Union. So the concept of quantitative power has disappeared. The fact that you have one hydrogen bomb is good enough as a deterrent as if you had 400. Entry into the nuclear club, therefore, is attended with some kind of international prestige. When France exploded its first weapon, it thought it became very important. Red China has recently exploded another, and it claims that it is now important. So passport to distinction and to importance lies along the route where you are able to explode successfully a thermonuclear device. by fission or by fusion, as the case may be. That then is the second phenomena which has turned up, control that man has acquired over the forces of nature. I have been so far talking of the control that man has acquired over the forces of nature in its application to the destructive potentialities of man's propensities. But surely he can utilize this control for peaceful purposes. Nuclear energy has been harnessed in the service of agriculture to stimulate production, to fight certain matters of diseases. Attempts are being made to harness this energy for the purpose of controlling the deserts of the world, conditioning their climate, making water available to them so that the deserts might bloom. Devices are underway for exploitation of the oceanic resources, subaquarial resources. Ocean life is full with chemicals, with food which man can live upon, and with nuclear power it should be possible now to bring to the service of man hidden energies that are found underwater and under the surface of the earth. It has been estimated that if disarmament program can be implemented, and if the national energies of the superpowers, instead of directing the application of the nuclear energy for the purpose of making more and better bombs, were to be utilized for the purpose of making the fruits of nuclear energy available for peaceful purposes, then we should be able to combat hunger, poverty, want, feed, clothe, shelter millions upon millions of people that at present go without any of those wherewithals. So along both sides you have the extreme possibilities. One possibility is the bringing to an end of human civilization by resort to violence. Another possibility is that we might bring up an era of plenty and prosperity, and mankind may be spared the type of effort which he normally puts forth for the purpose of production of wealth. Scarcity will become a thing of the past, and we will be able to accommodate the family of Adam in decent housing condition, fight diseases, educate them, feed them. Now these, as I said, reflects the kind of world in which we live. These are the involvements, they are the coordinates of a human approach to the problem of modern living. This is the first side of the coin. Let's look at the other side of the coin, and that is that humanity today, politically considered, is living in what are called sovereign nation states, supposed to be about 110 of them, going by the roster of United Nations. Each is sovereign. Sovereignty is a legal term. Most of you are familiar with it, but there would be some who are not. All nation states that compose international community of mankind are supposed to be sovereign. By that is meant that they do not acknowledge any authority over and above themselves. All nations, big and small, are in the eye of international law equal. They are sovereign. All of them are sovereign. Nepal is as much sovereign as the United States of America. Togoland in Africa is probably as much sovereign as the Soviet Union. Small states in the physical sense, with small populations, small resources, are nevertheless as important as are the big powers in the eye of international law. And this stems from the fact that not one of them, that is not one of these 110 odd nation states, acknowledges an authority superior to itself for the determination of its domestic and foreign policies. What is the result of this phenomena? You can well imagine. Each nation today pursues what it calls a policy of enlightened self-interest. So 110 nations, each pursues what it considers is a policy consistent with enlightened self-interest. And as you know, what is meat for one is poison for another. And in this world, good things of life are few. The demand stems from numerous sources, and that naturally gives rise to conflicts. If each nation is sovereign, refusing to acknowledge an authority superior to itself in the determination of its domestic and foreign policies, and yet is pledged to pursuing a policy of enlightened self-interest, the possibility that in the pursuit of the policy of enlightened self-interest it may come in conflict with the pursuit by another nation of its own policy of enlightened self-interest is there. And therefore there are conflicts. And these conflicts that arise on the international scene are merely the ramifications or the variations on the theme of the dogma of sovereign equality of all nations. No nation is prepared to surrender any part of its sovereignty for the creation of any superior national authority charged with the duty of ironing out these conflicts, easing these tensions, avoiding conflicts that normally beget wars. We are in fact therefore living in an age of international anarchy and disorder. We have no apparatus, we have no methodologies, we have no techniques of accredited kind by recourse to which we are able to settle those conflicts that per se would arise given the fact that 110 states, each pledged to pursue its enlightened self-interest, comes in conflict with other neighboring nations that wish to pursue similar policies. It is inherent in the situation, and we have no institutional devices by which we can fight them out. You could say, what about the United Nations? Is not United Nations a device, an institution, a technique by recourse to which conflicts can be ironed out? The answer is, read the history of the working of the United Nations from 1945 and you will get the answer for yourself. In 1945, with the conclusion of the Second World War, the victorious Allies assembled and they wanted to find out the method by which they could preserve the peace which they had won. They said, we have won the war and therefore we can also keep the peace. And when at the invitation of these big powers, then 5 in number, Soviet Union, France, England, United States of America and China, other powers were invited to meet in San Francisco to discuss the organs that should be set up, the institutions that must be set up in order to find out a framework in which peace can be kept. About 45 nations assembled and they drew up a charter of the United Nations which was supposed to be a method whereby world peace could be kept, whereby conflicts could be eradicated, whereby international disputes could be settled. The argument which prevailed in the conference and which is written into the charter was that the 5 big powers that were responsible for winning the war will really be the custodians of world peace. The argument was that if any one of these five powers refuses to keep the world peace, then there is nothing that you can do about it. And consequently, the only way to keep such peace as is available is to assume that these five powers that had won the war will continue to cooperate in the eager maintenance of that atmosphere in which peace can prevail in the world. And the expression of this belief is found in the veto power, which was reserved under Article 27 in the Constitution of the Charter of United Nations, and goes into the operation of the Security Council. You know, Security Council consists of 11 members, 5 of whom are permanent members. They permanently have seats. Others come and go, but they go on forever. But they have also the power to veto any resolution that is proposed. And it has so happened that at least Soviet Union from 1945 to date has exercised veto power for more than 100 times. The result is that all areas where conflicts develop and are about to be taken care of by the Security Council of the Charter of the United Nations, for reasons that I will give presently, the Soviet Union has found fit to veto the consideration of those questions, with the result that they have been lifted off the agenda of the working of the Security Council and not become part of the agenda of the working of the United Nations. When after the Korean War in 1950 it became obvious to the United States of America that frequent resort was being had to the veto power by the Soviet Union, and by that time had emerged what is called Cold War, a term with which you should be familiar, a term which tends to show that we are at war anyhow, but the condition of the war is such that it is cold. Cold War means the thermal condition is not good enough, that's all, but it is war. So we are at war. Sometimes the temperature goes up and sometimes it comes down, but we are at crossroads, we are in conflict. And the Soviet Union, as leader of the Soviet socialist world, and United States of America as the captain of the so-called free world, have been at loggerheads. It's not a part of my province in this small talk to go into the history of the genesis of that trouble, but the fact remains that Cold War has become the feature of our own age in which we live. So there is war going on all the time, and the war is now being fought within the framework of the United Nations, insofar as all questions of conflict that come up for being adjudicated or dealt with within the framework of the United Nations are about to be vetoed by the Soviet Union, because it believes that it is not possible for it to get a kind of result which may be in consonance with its own policy. However, be that as it may, in 1950, what the United States did was it got passed a resolution in the General Assembly, which is technically called Uniting for Peace Resolution of 1950. And the substance of this maneuver was that should, because of the operation and resort to veto power, Security Council failed to function, and Security Council was the main organ to which was committed the duty of establishing conditions for maintaining world peace, then the matter should come transferred to the General Assembly of the United Nations, and United Nations General Assembly then can take any action it likes for the purpose of making recommendations, for the purpose of ensuring peace. What they did therefore was that they transferred the power of the Security Council to deal with threats to peace and aggression, and brought it to the General Assembly by means of the passing of this resolution, Uniting for Peace resolution. At that time it was hoped and it was believed by the United States that the United States had sufficient majority to always get 2/3 vote in the General Assembly, because unless you have 2/3 vote in the General Assembly on an important question, it's not possible to carry through any resolution. And any resolution in the General Assembly can only be recommendatory, it is not mandatory, it is not binding. But still they felt that the world conscience will have spoken. And since they had a large clientele states at that time, and Soviet Union hadn't got that following, they believed that it was possible for them to be able to get 2/3 majority. So the power of the Security Council to keep world peace was artificially transferred to the General Assembly. But what happened in the General Assembly was that everyone there had one vote. I told you that small powers have one vote, the big powers have one vote. And by this time the colonial empires in Asia and Africa were tottering. Smaller states of Asia and Africa were becoming members. Original membership of the United Nations was about 45 and today it is about 111. The result is that progressively the smaller powers are beginning to be important, and now Afro-Asian bloc is capable of fabricating its own majority of 2/3 without having to say anything to Soviet Union or anything to the United States of America. So the original conception that United States will be able to push through all manner of resolutions is no longer available because that majority is not available since another majority of the ex-colonial powers territories which have come up in the form of sovereign states of Asia and Africa are able to have that majority. The result is that even United States today is sick, mentally sick if I may say so, of the working of the United Nations. And recently in our own year, General Assembly met and did nothing, because by this time a controversy came up, and that was that the Soviet Union and France had not paid what are called charges due on peacekeeping operations in Congo and elsewhere. The objection of the Soviet Union and France was that we need not pay this amount because the Uniting for Peace resolution was unconstitutional, and whatever has happened in Congo and whatever has happened elsewhere is not our responsibility, and why should we pay? And it is for the United States of America to pay, since that was the resolution is sponsored by United States of America, and they were interested in getting the General Assembly to act. Be that as it may, there was an opinion that was sought from the by the Court of International Justice, and that opinion went in favor of the view that the Soviet Union and France should make a payment of what is called peacekeeping operations, but they have not paid. And the argument arose that if they don't pay, then they have no right to vote. Soviet Union said, all right, if you don't allow us to vote, we walk out. And so there was a stalemate. This time the General Assembly that started meeting somewhere in December, carried on in September, went up right up to February. There was no voting done at all. The fear was that if you press a vote, and then the Soviet Union says, I want to give a vote, then America would say, you have no right to vote because you haven't paid for it. Under the Charter of the United Nations, a person that does not pay the contribution, the power that does not pay the contribution, cannot be allowed to vote. And then the Soviet Union said, all right, if it is so, then we walk out. Now, if they walk out, then what happens to the United Nations, because it is one of the superpowers? The result is that this year, no work has been transacted in the General Assembly, excepting what may be called through consensus. And lastly, on the day I was leaving United States of America, I think it was 16th of February, something very remarkable happened. The Albanian delegate went up to the rostrum and he said, up to now we have not been voting on any question. The matter is being decided by the consensus. I want it to be voted whether you want to vote or not. You know, he took up the position. Now that was a terrible consternation that went on, and you could have been in the United Nations to be able to see what was happening, because he did create a situation in which the question had to be voted whether there should be vote or not. He said, I want that to be decided. Up to now you have not been voting by a consensus. I want this to be now voted. And naturally Soviet Union would have been called upon to vote, and the Americans would have said, you can't vote, in which case they would have walked out. And then a volte-face was staged, and the maneuver was, I think Adlai Stevenson on behalf of United States of America said that after all this is not a vote on a substantive question, so we have no objection if Soviet Union also votes. It's a question of procedure. Because of procedure we have really no feeling in the matter. If it was a substantial question, then we would have objected. The result was that only two powers voted for the Albanian point of view, and others of course agreed that there should be no voting. And now the General Assembly has adjourned sine die, and we do not know what is going to happen to the United Nations. I think both Soviet Union as well as United States of America feel that the power complex in the world has changed. What happened is this. Initially, there were 5 powers, as I told you. They had won the war, big powers. and they undertook to keep the peace. If the five powers had agreed and were unanimous, they could keep the peace because the superpowers would be one of them. Soviet Union is a superpower, America is a superpower. But in the meanwhile, some other radical changes have taken place. Some powers that were believed to be big are no longer big. Great Britain is not that big power today. France, with all de Gaulle, whatever he might say, is not that big power today. And China is no longer identifiable as the kind of China in which Chiang Kai-shek was there. In the meanwhile, Mao Zedong has turned up, and Zhou Enlai has turned up, and they say we are China, and that China is not being identified and is not being recognized. What is happening in the United Nations, therefore, is that the power reality which is functioning outside the United Nations is beginning to have projections inside the framework of United Nations. Because United Nations is nothing more than nations united. If nations are divided, then United Nations cannot have any authority or control over them. United Nations has no authority, no control over Soviet Union. It can veto any question. It has no authority, no control over United States of America. It can veto any question. It has no control over them at all. And if they do not wish to keep the peace, there is nothing that United Nations can do about it. Because United Nations merely reflects a kind of reality that is functioning outside the framework of United Nations. It is not anything sui juris, it is not anything autonomous, it is not anything which is supranational. It is merely the assemblage of the nations that are functioning under the Charter. And I have given you some kind of a bird's eye view of what has happened to the working of the United Nations, how it has not been allowed to function because of the existence of Cold War politics, and how now a situation has been reached in which, frankly, General Assembly is not able to function. And of course, as you know, Security Council has never been able to function quite for some time because of the veto power that has been resorted to. So I started by saying that on the political side, we have an international community of mankind divided into 110 states, each sovereign, each equal to the other, not acknowledging any authority superior to itself, each pursuing its own enlightened self-interest, and therefore due to come in conflict with the interest of another. And you have the pockets of conflicts going on between the Arabs and the Israelis, between the Greeks and the Cyprians. You have going on quarrels in the Vietnam. These are all pockets where conflicts are raging and raging very violently. These are the sore spots of the world. Cuba, till lately, Congo. These are the ugly spots in terms of which you can understand the conflicts which are coming up. Nations wanting to claim an attitude to foreign policy which is in consonance with their self-interest. And I told you, United Nations cannot function. What is the way out? People say, let us amend the Charter. This is one way that is being suggested. If the Charter is out of date, let us amend it. How do you amend the Charter? Under the provisions of the Charter, Article 111 or whatever it is, you can amend the Charter if the 5 permanent powers agree that it should be amended. But if they agree, you don't have to amend it. We want to amend it because they don't agree. And unless they agree, you can't amend it. Now tell me how to get out of this vicious circle. If they are in agreement, we don't have to amend the Charter. And unless they are in agreement, we can't amend the Charter. So you go round and round it, and it's impossible to come out of the situation. I don't think these 5 powers are going to agree on amendment of the Charter, because then each would like to have a slice of power for itself, which the other would not be prepared to concede. You know, after the Second World War, the 5 permanent powers were in a good mood. They had won the war. It was a kind of a honeymoon time, you know, where the husband and wife always agree. And then the conflicts came up, and when the conflicts came up, they have come up, and now there is no way out of them. What is the way out of this impasse that has overtaken the world? And what is at fault? What has gone wrong? That on the one hand, whole mankind can live as one family. That was the first point I made. In the atomic era, any war is senseless because there will be no victor, no vanquished at the end of it. As I said, the victor and the vanquished will both be buried in probably the same chantry floor, at the same level. There is going to be no winner in this war. That is very well known. On the other hand, I said, humanity, by organizing itself properly and availing of the powers of control it has had over its environment, is capable of applying for peaceful purposes the fruits of atomic energy to such an extent that this vast desert land of the Saharas and the Gobi and the Pamirs, even the polar regions, can be brought under human habitation. With the rising potential of human population coming to fruition, we may be able to feed them, shelter them, and clothe them. We may be able to tackle the problem of hunger, disease, poverty, and want. These are the possibilities. If all the resources which at present are being utilized for the purpose of building bigger and better armaments were transferred to the arena of economic welfare of the human race, then there will be enough to live. On the other hand, I told you that we are showing a great deal of immaturity in the way we organize ourselves politically. Our international law is no law at all. There is international anarchy, there is international disorder. The only apparatus for the purpose of ironing out these differences was the United Nations. Unfortunately, they have destroyed the efficaciousness of United Nations. Some miracle might be able to restore some health to it, but we'll have to wait for that miracle to occur. Rationally, at least, one doesn't see what is going to be the way out. What is the way out? The answer lies in promoting and fostering international understanding. Because the basis of all conflict is in the human heart. The foundation of every tension in the world is ultimately to be traced to the thinking of the people. It is there that the germs of disaster, of war, of conflicts are sowed. It is the human heart and the human mind which is the breeding ground where these tensions and conflicts emerge. Unless you smother them there by some method, it is not a possibility for anyone to answer the problem which is confronting the modern world. Actually, the Charter of the United Nations, if you read it, begins with the expression, "We the peoples of the United Nations." The opening words of the Charter of the United Nations are, "We the peoples of the United Nations." The Charter of the League of Nations, which is the predecessor institution of United Nations, did not begin with those words. It begins with the high contracting parties. The covenant of the League of Nations was an agreement between the nations, whereas the Charter of the United Nations is declared in the name of the peoples of the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations people speak in the name of their governments through their own delegates. But the source and the authority of the law of United Nations is declared to be the peoples, because when wars are declared and fought, it is not nations that suffer, it is the people. People of flesh and blood. It is the mothers who lose their children, fathers who lose their children, their hearts, their homes, their limb, their life. It is this devastation that overtakes them in terms of suffering, toils, and tears. It is the individual men and women and children who suffer. And the starting point of the Charter of the United Nations was, in order to eradicate that war which twice in our own lifetime has menaced us, we have assembled here and we are designing these procedures, establishing these institutions with a view to securing the avoidance of war, maintenance of peace, promotion of economic and social advancement of the peoples of the world. Those were the objectives in the name of which the peoples of the United Nations met through the accredited representatives of the government. And unless in the peoples of the United Nations is spread this awareness and this understanding, because after all, governments are controlled by the peoples. Governments are not something that come prefabricated from above. Governments are made by human beings and are controlled by the people who live in the nations whose governments they are. And if the people all over the world were rich in understanding that today we are living in an age where it is not possible to think of regionalism, of racialism, of merely nationalism. It's not possible to have peace in an isolated part of the world because peace must be total. Since this is an era of total war, wars of localized type are apt to be escalated and become total wars. Therefore, the peace also cannot anymore be regional and local. It has also to be total. That peace cannot be won for a given people, or a given plot of land, or a given region, or a given race. It must today be fought for and obtained and kept and maintained in the name of whole humanity, because whole humanity somehow has already become one. Anything that is happening anywhere is, as I told you, affecting everything else that is happening everywhere in the world. It is in this fostering of understanding, of enriching the soul lives of the people, of giving them basic approach to the problems of life, enlivening them, quickening them, fostering in them this kind of universal outlook, attempting to beget a man whose outlook is global, who transcends the national frontiers. And they are the warriors, and every race and every nation does contain those people. And it is on them that it lies heavily today, the thinkers, the intellectuals, the sages, the poets, the philosophers, those whom God has given something to give to the world. On them lies the duty today to proclaim ceaselessly and to affirm continually and to strive perennially for the advancement of the basic aspiration of mankind, which is as old as mankind itself. All the great traditional religions of mankind that we know of have taught and preached about the brotherhood of man, about fatherhood of God, about the divine origin of man, about the divine destination of man, about the dignity of the individual, his accountability. Up to a point, this has been merely taught as Sunday sermons. It has been taught merely in temples. It has not been spread out and made a living credo. It has not been more or less assimilated in the soul life of the people. But now the atom bomb, the hydrogen bomb, and the progeny have arrived. And they are confronting mankind with a challenge that if they don't learn this lesson, what was at one time given on the dispensation of the teaching of the universal prophets, then the end of mankind is no far. The confrontation, this dialogue that is taking place. One of the greatest writers and the most perceptive writers, am I taking more of your time? One of the perceptive writers, John Strachey, wrote a book on the prevention of war. And he saw in three factors that I shall enumerate the possibility that mankind may be able to get over the kind of predicament in which it is involved. And one of them was, he thought that the capitalistic system and the socialist system are no longer to be viewed in sharp focus of contrariety or hostility, that they are breaking down, that their angularities are giving way to some sort of a compromise, that free enterprise economy of the classical economists is no longer characteristic of United States, that the socialist economy of the type of which Marx spoke is no longer characteristic today of the socialist world, that compromises are coming in, that progressively the sharpness of the outline of these systems will go, and therefore this dialogue, which is the dialogue of the Cold War, will come to an end. Second was the emergence of the nuclear age. He thought in the nuclear age it is not possible for us to fool about, that we'll have to be serious with the business of keeping peace, because if we don't design methods for keeping peace, then the war will come which will bring about the extermination of the whole human race. And finally and fundamentally, he says, mankind is beginning to have loyalty for higher aims and for higher purposes. Lastly, in this thought comes to me the image of what we as children were taught. The Persian poet says, how strange, he says, that when whole body is in pain, it is only the eyes that weep. Have you, he says, wondered over this remarkable phenomena that when there is an agony in your soul, tears only flow down your eyes. You know, the hands don't weep, your legs don't weep. It is only the eyes that weep. And so he raises the question, why? Why is it that eyes should have the burden of articulating human agony of the whole organism and finds the answer, they carry the burden of articulating the agony of the system because they are gifted, they see the farthest of all the organs in your system. Eyes have the highest place because they see the farthest, they see the stars that are millions and millions of miles away. Because they are gifted with this vision, they are charged with the burden also of articulating the agony of mankind. Therefore, there are some people who are the eyes of society. They are the men of vision. Blessed are those who are the men of vision, because without men of vision, as the psalmist teaches, nations perish. The narrow type, the type that does not see beyond its own nose, the type that is limited to the personal interest, is not the type that matters. It's like the hands of humanity, and hands are not that important as eyes. But there are some who are the eyes of humanity because they are the men of vision. On them is cast the duty of ceaselessly proclaiming and publicizing the broader aims of humanity, and international understanding could be an aspect of it.